Welcome to those of you who are here with us in person, and to those of you with us from wherever you might be. Whoever you are, whomever you love, whatever you are mourning or celebrating, enduring or overcoming, you are welcome here. All people of goodwill are invited to join us on this great journey of the mind, the heart, and the spirit. Our call to worship today is Each in His Own Tongue by William Herbert Caruth. A fire mist and a planet, a crystal and a cell, a jellyfish and a saurian, and caves where the cavemen dwell. Then a sense of law and beauty and a face turned from the clod. Some call it evolution, and others call it God. A haze on the far horizon, the infinite tender sky, the ripe, rich tint of the cornfields and the wild geese sailing high. And all over upland and lowland, the charm of the goldenrod. Some of us call it autumn, and others call it God. Like tides on a crescent sea beach when the moon is new and thin, into our hearts high yearnings come from the mystic ocean whose rim no foot has trod. Some of us call it longing, and others call it God. A picket frozen on duty, a mother starved for her brood, Socrates drinking the hemlock, and Jesus on the rood, and millions who humble and nameless the straight and hard pathway plod. Some call it consecration, and others call it God. Again, welcome.
Whomever you are, we are so glad you've joined us here today. Please join us in our welcome song. We are many, we are one. The light of the world is within you. Sacred and worthy is your soul. A place has been made for you. Awake, ocean born, behold this force. Bring the outside in, explode the self to epiphany. The very core of life, the soaring high of truth and light. The music of this awe, deep silence tween the notes, deafens me with endless love. This vagrant island earth, a pilgrim shining bright, we are shuddering before the beautiful, before the plentiful, we the voyagers. Tales from the seas, cathedrals of green, the very core of life, the soaring high of truth and light. this awe, deep silence between the notes, deafens me with endless love. This vagrant island earth, a pilgrim shining bright, we are shuddering before the beautiful, before the plentiful, we are voyagers. Of this awe, deep silence between the notes, deafens me with endless love. This vagrant island earth, a pilgrim shining bright, we are shuddering before the beautiful, before the plentiful, we are voyagers. The music of this awe, deep silence between the throats, deafens me with endless love. This vagrant island earth, a pilgrim shining bright, we are shuddering before the beautiful, before the volatile, we are voyagers.
Good morning. I'm Erin Kenworthy, the Director of Religious Exploration. If you're young or young at heart and you want to come up for Time for All Ages, I invite you to come up, but you don't have to. It's almost the 4th of July, which is our country's birthday celebration. On birthdays, it's a good time to think about how an individual has changed since their last birthday. How have they grown? What have they learned, and what new things can they do? Changes happen to groups of people, too. Some of the changes since our last national birthday have a lot of people feeling disappointed and angry and sad and frustrated, and it's okay to feel that way. We can remember that our story isn't over and that we can use the time between this birthday and the next one to work for changes worth celebrating. So this morning, I'm sharing with you the story of the peppered moth. It's also a story about change in the animal world. Although not all scientists agree about the specifics of the story, I think it's an interesting one to share this morning because change happens all the time, and that helps me feel hopeful when I'm frustrated. I just want to lift up also that I'm telling a story about moths, and my children absolutely 100% detest moths, and I'm wearing them on my head. So we will have a long discussion probably at home after this story. A long time ago, most peppered moths had white or gray wings with little dots on them. And that's why people called them peppered, because the dots kind of looked like pepper. Instead of sleeping at night like we do, these moths are awake at night and sleep during the day. And while they're sleeping, they like to hang out on trees. In some parts of the world, they spend lots of time resting on a type of tree called a birch tree, which normally has light-colored bark with dark spots on it. Lichen also grows on the tree bark, which makes it look even lighter. That way, their light-colored wings would blend in with the tree while they were resting, and it would be harder for other animals like birds to find them and eat them. Pretty cool, right? What do we call that when an animal can disguise themselves in the environment? Camouflage is where I'm headed with that. When animals blend in like that, it's called camouflage. But even though almost all peppered moths had light wings, always, there were a few that were born that had dark colored wings with little white spots on them. There weren't very many of them because it was really easy for birds to spot them against the light birch trees, so they were always the first ones eaten. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah, all right. But then something happened to make the light trees become dark. More than 200 years ago, people started building and working in factories, places where all sorts of things were made, and it was an exciting time because lots of stuff was being made very quickly, everything from clothes to enormous metal boats, and that time period we call the Industrial Revolution. Most factories burned coal for energy to power their machines, and burning coal is pretty dirty and messy, especially when there are lots of factories doing it at the same time. And all that dirt and smoke in the air cause problems for the environment, including the moths. Sometimes humans can make some really big messes. And I hope that we humans can keep in mind that our choices and behaviors have impacts on other humans and animals in the environment that we live in. Humans burned so much coal back then that the smoke made the air all dirty, and the tree lichen growing on those light-colored trees died. And then the birch trees got darker too because it was like little pieces of coal had been rubbed and sprinkled all over the trees. The darker tree bark was a problem for the peppered moths. It used to be that the light-colored ones would blend in with the trees, but now they didn't, and they were very easy to see. It was super easy for birds to find them and eat them, and soon there weren't as many peppered moths as there used to be. But those few moths with darker wings were totally fine. Now that the trees were darker, it was easier for them to hide, and suddenly more darker winged moths were able to live long enough to have babies which also had darker wings, and then those moth children grew up and had more moth children. So gradually, over many decades, the moths with darker wings became way more common than the moths with lighter wings. And scientists call this process natural selection, when some living things have a trait that helps them survive or adapt to a changed environment, like the moth's darker wings, there end up being more babies that also have that trait. And when an environment changes, animal populations also go through changes to adapt to the new environment. And that's how peppered moths change from mostly having light wings to mostly having dark wings. But the story doesn't end there. When humans realized that the factories were messing up the air, eventually, they figured out new and better ways of making stuff without burning as much coal and making the air as dirty. Over time, the air got cleaner, and guess what happened? The bark on the birch trees got lighter again, and then the lichen started to grow back, and then those moths with the darker wings started to stick out again, and the moths with the lighter wings had an easier time hiding from the birds. And natural selection happened all over again. And today, the peppered moths with lighter wings are much more common than the ones with darker wings. So I wonder what will happen next. This is just one example of how one type of animal changed over time because there was something that helped some of them survive. Natural selection happens with all types of living things all the time. It just usually takes too long for us to notice as it's happening. There are examples of this type of change everywhere we look. Some changes just happen, like a baby growing into a toddler, growing into a child, then into a teen, and then into an adult with every birthday that comes along. Or moth wing color helping camouflage moths from predators in a changing environment. Some changes happen because people make choices, like when humans made the choice to reduce air pollution. Let us find the courage to make the changes we can with our choices. What changes can we make between now and our nation's next birthday? Please join me in singing our children out to story time this morning.
For our song today, we are singing Where Do We Come From? And it is number 1003 in the teal hymnal. And it has 4 different parts, and we're going to sing each part 2 times. And then we're going to sing it again, and you can choose the part that you like the best. And we'll sing 4 more times through. Oh, please stand as you are willing and able and join us in singing, Where Do We Come From? From where are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Where do we come from? Mystery, mystery. Life is a riddle and a mystery, mystery, mystery. Life is a riddle and a mystery. Where do we come from? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Where do we come from? Mystery, mystery. Life is a riddle and a mystery. Mystery, mystery. Life is a riddle and a mystery.
Sally Isaacson, your assistant treasurer. We are not having a giving in action collection today. The organization couldn't come and said they had all the money they needed. So, I want to thank all of you for the generosity you've shown through the years, your contributions of time and treasure, and I have some requests. Now, I was looking on Breeze the other day. I can't tell you how many congregants are gray circles. Not smiling faces, but gray circles. Now, as a person of a certain age, I often have trouble remembering people's names. So I often remember their faces, but I don't remember the names. Or I remember the names and don't remember the faces. But that doesn't work because all I see is a gray circle. So I am tasking you with becoming a tech genius. Take a selfie, upload it onto your computer, open Breeze, and upload it into your profile. Then I'll be able to see your smiling faces, and I won't have to call you Hun, which is my go-to. Now, the other thing I want to talk to you about is many of you joined in the last 3 years, and you may not have had an opportunity to go to any of the auction offerings. Let me tell you, first of all, they always have wonderful food. Second of all, if you go to a concert, you can't believe how beautiful it is. And third of all, this is how you get to know each other. You don't get to know each other walking in and out of church. You go hi, and that's it. But at an auction item, you have the opportunity to hear somebody's story, to find out what they're interested in, to get hooked up because you like the same movie. So I urge you to look at the 8 offerings that we still have and think about joining them. Now, that's it. 2 things you have to do. And I think you can remember them. Thanks very much, and we will take an offering, but it'll be for us.
Freely given are gratefully received. Thank you for your contributions, your generosity, your support of the life and the work of our congregation. I want to take a moment and just acknowledge that although we have a wonderful staff, we are volunteer run. This whole enterprise here at 14th and Lafayette Street. And so I just want to invite you if you have been part of that volunteer effort in any way over the years, if you've been on a task force or a committee or shown up for something or helped out at the door, would you just stand up so we can just recognize all of our many volunteers? And give yourselves a huge hand. Thank you. Just a note to the folks who are watching from home. We know that there are some technical difficulties in our broadcast right now, and our marvelous volunteers are working to fix those. So please be patient if you are out there in the world somewhere watching us from a distance. I want to let you know, remind you, I mentioned this last week, but this congregation now has a reproductive rights and reproductive justice congregational project, and there was going to be a meeting of that project a week from today, Sunday the 10th at 7 p.m. here in the church building. So that information has been in first announced. It'll be in first announced next week too, but I want to make sure you are aware of it, and I want to make sure you feel invited, because you are. I also want to just briefly let you know I'm really excited about some of the Sunday services coming up this summer. I've been able to get commitments from some of my favorite people to come and speak here. My friend Theo Wilson is going to be speaking here next week. Yeah. Many of you will remember Cindy Pincus, who was our sort of interim Sunday worship minister while I was on sabbatical a few years ago. Reverend Kristen Saki, who was also a member of our congregation. And I'm really pleased that Shara Smith, who is the new executive director of the Colorado Interfaith Alliance, is going to be coming to speak here on the 31st. And my dear old friend, who I've known for 20 odd years, Reverend Alicia Ford, is coming in August. So I'm just really grateful for all of those wonderful folks and their willingness to come and share themselves from our pulpit. I want to let you know that Gene Wolfe, a longtime member of our congregation, passed away this past Wednesday morning. Jean's been around a very long time. Not too much recently. She's had a number of health issues, but both her children and all 5 of her grandchildren are veterans of the 9th grade trip. That's how long that Gene Wolfe has been associated with our congregation. There will be a memorial service this coming Wednesday at 1 o'clock right here. I want to give a shout out and a blessing to all those among and beyond us who deal with conditions and illnesses that cannot be readily seen or observed. Depression, anxiety, fear, despair, chronic pain or fatigue, neuropathy, Crohn's disease, all of its variants, arthritis, joints that don't work right, migraines, loneliness, and isolation. These are all things that people in this room right now deal with on a regular basis. They cannot be seen with the naked eye, and those are heavy, heavy burdens to carry. If you are someone who carries one of these very heavy burdens, you are not broken. You are not imagining anything. You are strong and resilient. You are a warrior. I also want to send up prayers today for all those who are mourning the decisions of the Supreme Court over the last 2 weeks. The overturning of Roe versus Wade, the attempt to strike down New York's attempt to regulate the carrying of guns in public, the approval of public prayer at public schools, and most recently, undermining the ability of the Environmental Protection Agency to protect clean air. If you are feeling the weight of these decisions, if you're feeling grief for the loss of rights and protections and common sense in your country, you're not alone. May you connect with others who feel as you do, as many of us here at First Unitarian Denver do, and may those connections bring you comfort, strength,
clarity and purpose. And lastly today, I want to pray, as I often do, for mercy and sanity on the part of those waging war, and for comfort and sustenance to the global refugees from war. Our prayer today is by an unknown author, but I'm quite fond of it. I'm not even sure if this is the right name for it, but it's how I've come across it. It's called the Felt Sense Prayer. It goes like this. I am the pain in your head, the knot in your stomach, the unspoken grief in your smile. I am your high blood pressure, your fear of challenge, your lack of trust. I am your hot flashes, your fragile low back, your agitation, your fatigue. You tend to disown me, suppress me, ignore me, inflate me, coddle me, condemn me. You usually want me to go away immediately, to disappear just back into obscurity. More times than not, I'm only the most recent notes in a long symphony, the most evident branches of roots that have been challenged for seasons. So I implore you, I'm a messenger with good news, as disturbing as I can be at times. I am wanting to guide you back to those tender places in yourself, the place where you can hold yourself with compassion and honesty. I may ask you to alter your diet, get more sleep, exercise regularly, breathe more consciously. I might encourage you to seek a vaster reality and worry less about the day-to-day fluctuations of life. I may ask you to explore the bonds and the wounds of your relationship. Wherever I lead you, my hope is that you will realize that success will not be measured by my eradication, but by the shift in the internal landscape from which I emerge. I am your friend, not your enemy. I belong. I have no desire to bring pain and suffering to your life. I'm simply tugging at your sleeve. I desire for you to allow me to speak to you in a way that enlivens your higher instincts for self-care. You are a being so vast, so complex, with amazing capacities for self-regulation and healing. Let me be one of the harbingers that lead you to the mysterious core of your being, where insight and wisdom are naturally available when called upon with a sincere heart. Amen.
Carnivore, sink your teeth into the hills, hide your nose if you're worried they'll find you out. Lick your lips clean of the lamb's meat and innocence. You are king of creatures because you kill. Herbivore, there are meadows and small parking lots full of luscious landscape geraniums. Wash your tongue in these waters you know so well. In the to bleed to death. Amoeba, I need you, swimming so confident, all alone in your test tube, parasite. You know you're not welcome here, breaking windows and sneaking under the skin. You are last in the circle the scientists made to give names to the wild things that live in the wood. Warrior, the bullets will bounce from your skin, mix your medicine, and feed the wounds of your men. Geronimo, they drove you off of your land, caught and captured like an animal. You died a man. Oh, Darwin, where are you? Oh, Darwin, where are you? We were fools to believe anything other than fools to believe anything other than fools to believe anything other than what you wrote in your notebook. Ashes to ashes, to dust, to dust. We were fools to believe anything other than fools to believe anything other than fools to believe anything other than.
I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Born in 1809 in Shrewsbury, Shropshire, say that fast 5 times, our speaker today was fascinated by the natural world from a young age. Growing up, he was an avid reader of nature books and devoted his spare time to exploring the fields and woodlands around his home, collecting plants and insects. In 1825, he enrolled in medical school at the University of Edinburgh, where he witnessed surgery on a child. Surgeries at that time would have been carried out without the use of anesthetic or antiseptics, and fatalities were common. Watching this procedure left him so traumatized that he gave up his studies without completing the course. He then went to Cambridge University to study theology. In 1831, in no rush to take holy orders, he accepted an offer to circle the world on a 5-year voyage. The journey would change both his life and the trajectory of Western scientific thinking. He explored remote regions and marveled at a world so different from the one he knew. He encountered birds with bright blue feet, sharks with T-shaped heads, and giant tortoises. He collected plants, animals, and fossils, and took copious field notes. Returning to England in 1836, he became a highly methodical scholar, collecting, observing, conferring with other scientists. He delayed publishing on the topic for a great number of years while he assembled a mountain of evidence and finally published On the Origin of Species in 1859. The book was widely published and provoked accusations of blasphemy and other scandals. Throughout his life, Charles Darwin preferred to live quietly, though he was a prolific writer of letters and had an enormous number of acquaintances. People who knew him will report that he was personally loving and thoughtful, a good conversationalist, and progressive in his politics. He was vocally abolitionist and a critic of politics and economics that excluded the poor. Although Darwin's theory of evolution has been modified over time, it remains fundamental to the study of the natural world. And his work changed not only the way we see all organisms, but the way we see ourselves. Please welcome Charles Darwin.
When on board the HMS Beagle, as a naturalist, I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution, in the inhabitants of South America, and in the geological relations of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent. These facts seem to me to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries, as it has been called by one of the greatest philosophers. On my return home, it occurred to me in 1837 that something might perhaps be made out of this question by patiently accumulating and reflecting on all sorts of facts which could possibly have any bearing on it. After 5 years of work, I allowed myself to speculate on the subject and drew up some short notes. These I enlarged in 1844 into a sketch of the conclusions, which then seemed to me probable. From that period to the present day, I have steadily pursued the same object. I hope I might be excused for entering on these personal details, as I give them to show that I have not been hasty in coming to a decision. That short passage is from the introduction to the first edition of On the Origin of Species, which is my most famous work. In hindsight, perhaps I should not have been so eager to engage and respond to my many critics. I spent the better part of the next 20 years revising that book to respond to those critics, putting out eventually 6 editions. But death gives one perspective. And from my vantage point now, the first edition was the most succinct and therefore the most valuable. In addition, I would observe that additional facts and data did little to persuade those for whom predetermined opinions are more immutable than facts. I notice this problem still exists in 2022. Given the very brief time I have with you today, I should like to cover a few matters of importance. I would like to convey a sense of the evidence that impressed upon me the conclusions I came to, conclusions reached with ample help and assistance from many fellow scientists of my time. Secondly, I will address one particular way in which I have been profoundly misinterpreted, abused even. And thirdly, I will conclude with a non-original, analogous representation of the origin of species in all humility and appreciation for the divergent beauty of life on this planet. The first and most familiar observations of descent with modification through natural selection were taken from plant and animal husbandry. Any farmer knows that crops, livestock, and even house pets can be shaped in both temperament and physical capacities by selective breeding. Humans have been doing this for thousands of years with tremendous success, and civilization depends upon it. Next, where I spent most of my energy was observing the characteristics and variations in nature, particularly finches, iguanas, and turtles, and generalizing widely from there. What is measurably observed in nature is that minute variations in character, behavior, and physiology among species are either adaptive or maladaptive to their environment. Individuals with slight adaptive variations from their immediate parents will have a better chance of survival and procreation, thus passing on the adaptive qualities of to their own offspring. Individuals with maladaptive variations over time will be less likely to procreate, and so those variations will tend toward extinction. The engine for this process is survival itself. The data shows that any given individual of any species will reproduce more offspring than can be sustained in a given environment. And so nature has built into it a high degree of mortality across the living spectrum. The data shows also how competition for existence is most fierce among individuals and varieties of the same species. Which leads to the core findings of descent with modification through natural selection. First is that the transmutation of species happens over time. Many generations responding to a given environment and the inevitable changes that happen in a given environment. The principle is incomprehensible in the context of a single moment or a single generation. It is only over many generations, intercrossed with corresponding changes in geographical location and geography in general, that we can trace the evolution of past species into present ones. The sheer number and varieties, the entire species that have faded to extinction vastly outnumber the very few that transmutate successfully. The history of species is overwhelming with death. A simple example of how this works. Imagine a portion of your beautiful Colorado wherein is a habitat friendly to brown mice. Imagine that over time a particular type of bird migrates to this area and discovers that brown mice make a tasty lunch. Now imagine that over time,
One or two members of a litter of brown mice are significantly darker than their siblings, and therefore less visible to hungry birds. Those mice will be more likely to grow older and reproduce offspring who will inherit their darker color. It is likely, over many generations, that there will still be mice in your portion of Colorado, but they will be a darker color from their ancestors. It must be remembered that this is but one of countless possible environmental pressures on a single population of a single species, on a single characteristic, resulting in measurable change. Yet the principle is universal for all possible characteristics of mice, of birds, of worms in the soil, of the fungi that decompose organic waste, of the grasses and the trees, of the seeds that both the mice and the birds consume, and the specialized bacteria that live in the uterus of brown mice. Natural selection within the laws of variation is an ongoing symphony of both death and adaptation where nothing operates independent of anything else. And every single note of that symphony, without exception, demonstrates the principle. In chapter 14, I wrote, "The framework of bones being the same in the hand of a man, the wing of a bat, the fin of a porpoise, and the leg of a horse. The same number of vertebrae forming the neck of the giraffe and of the elephant, and innumerable other such facts at once explain themselves on the theory of descent with slow and slight successive modifications. The similarity of pattern in the wing and leg of a bat, though used for such different purpose, in the jaws and legs of a crab, in the petals, stamens, and pistils of a flower, is likewise unintelligible on the view of the gradual modification of parts and organs, which were alike in an early progenitor of each class. On the principle of successive variations, we can clearly see why the embryos of mammals, birds, reptiles, and fishes should be so closely alike and so unlike their adult forms." This, in rough outline, is the principle of descent with modification through natural selection, now more commonly referred to as evolution. I would like to turn my attention now to a second matter of great concern and great pain to me personally. Mr. Herbert Spencer, a contemporary of mine, with whom I had extensive correspondence, did insist upon misapplying my work in a very specific and, in my view, a very harmful way. To be clear, I harbor no ill will toward my colleague, Mr. Spencer, only the greatest respect and also the greatest disagreement. It was Mr. Spencer who first coined the phrase survival of the fittest, a phrase which I later adopted, though we intended very different things by that phrase. Mr. Spencer was deeply familiar with biology and with my own work, though his own specialty was economics and social policy, on which he published numerous articles and books. Mr. Spencer believed and sought to promote the idea that not only physical qualities were heritable through natural or unnatural selection, but also the qualities of personality. Qualities such as industry or laziness, honesty or dishonesty, selfishness or selflessness, humor, seriousness, capacity for wisdom, and so on. To my personal regret, several writers in the later 1800s began to use the phrase social Darwinism, implying that my scientific work was applicable to principles of social and economic development. This
was a theory I briefly investigated and determined to be absent of both evidence and scientific rigor. Nonetheless, despite my objections, over the decades, social Darwinism and the survival of the fittest were used to justify monarchy, slavery, eugenics, laissez-faire capitalism, and even genocide. Mr. Spencer used the phrase survival of the fittest to indicate that only the strong survive, and only the strong should survive. Spencer and others inserted a moral component into both survival and strength, which I could not support as a scientist. They envisioned an economic and political system in which the poor would stay poor in order to toughen up their character over time and slow down their procreation, while the already powerful would stay powerful to pass on their supposed qualities of strength, intelligence, and industry. I should like to be as clear as I can that while I did use the phrase survival of the fittest in later editions of my books, the meaning I intended was along the lines of natural selection, as I have previously identified. The fittest were those who inherited slight variations that allowed them to fit into their environment with a slight advantage over those who inherited less adaptive adaptations. In no way did I agree with the application of principles of evolution to the social and political uses to which they were misapplied. There is some argument among my biographers about my own social beliefs, which I shall not try to rectify here, except to say that my father was a well-known Unitarian. I was an emphatic abolitionist and was publicly agnostic about the existence of God. Furthermore, my work and observations of nature, especially of social creatures such as human beings, demonstrate that cooperation is a far more valuable survival strategy than individualism. I wrote about this at length in a later book called The Descent of Man. Specifically, that a moral sense of right and wrong, protection of the vulnerable, and sacrificing for the common good within human beings and other mammals is clearly a successful adaptive strategy, survival strategy, rather than a weakness to be exploited. I would be presumptive enough to urge you who live here in the 21st century to ponder these matters deeply, especially given the environmental pressures you are facing on a global scale. It is evident that cooperation will be a far more successful strategy for survival than individualism or nationalism. I will close with a passage I wrote in 1859, whose content will be self-explanatory, as follows. The affinities of all the beings in the same class have sometimes been represented by a great tree. I believe this simile largely speaks the truth. The green and budding twigs may represent existing species, and those produced during each former year may represent a long succession of extinct species. The limbs divided into great branches, and these into lesser and lesser branches, were themselves once, when the tree was small, budding twigs. And this connection of the former and present buds by ramifying branches may well represent the classification of all extinct and living species in groups subordinate to groups. From the first growth of the tree,
Many a limb and branch has decayed and dropped off. And these lost branches of various sizes may represent those whole orders, families, the genera, which have now no living representatives, and which are known to us only from having been found in a fossil state. As buds give rise by growth to fresh buds, and these, if vigorous, branch out and overtop all in a feebler branch, so by generation I believe it has been with the tree of life, which fills with its dead and broken branches the crust of the earth, and covers the surface with its ever-branching and beautiful ramifications. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Darwin, that was quite a mouthful. I'm going to spare you having to spout my little summary of Mr. Darwin's comments, but I would like you to rise and help me by, at the end of each verse, singing, "Evolution makes it so." So if you will please rise, if you're willing and able, you can remain standing for the closing affirmation and for the benediction. Darwin's natural selection, adaptation for protection, Mother Nature's own corrections, evolution makes it so. Higher forms Darwin's denying, all forms great in heaven's eye, and natural selection's triumph, evolution makes it so. Might think the world is just you when the world in fact ignores you. Other creatures aren't made for you. Evolution makes it so. And if you want my opinion, life forms are no one's dominions. You're no better than an onion. Evolution makes it so. Now we know the world is turning, and we know species are churning. I hope that that's not too concerning. Evolution makes it so. If you think this is the end, who knows if you're right, my friend. Just like when it all began, evolution makes it so.
Binds us forever together throughout all time, through life and death, and the space between the stars. Throughout all time, through life and death, and the space between the stars.
A benediction today. In a round world, what goes around comes around. Circles and cycles of stars, seasons of growth and decay, birth and death and unexpected resurrection. you and I and we are inextricably linked to all that is and was and ever will be. Amen. Our service is ended. Thank you.